Lydia, Namubiru, I'm the Africa editor for an open democracy project called Tracking the Backlash. And what Tracking the Backlash typically does is investigative journalism on, typically it's all about organized opposition to women's and LGBTIQ people's rights. But during the pandemic, we noticed and felt that we had to also do some investigation around basically the neglect of women's rights that isn't necessarily being driven by some of the activist campaigning groups that we typically track, but those kind of just, women were forgotten in some instances, during the pandemic. So if you don't already know openDemocracy, we are a UK-based independent media organization. And Tracking the Backlash is part of our feminist journalism strand, called 50/50. It's the investigative part of our feminist journalism strand. So in March 2020, the WHO declared coronavirus, COVID-19, a global pandemic. Interestingly, as soon as it did, within about 10 days of the declaration, it republished its guidelines on respectful and respectful maternity care, reaffirming that women still had the right to high quality care before, during, and after childbirth, and that should include a companion of choice during delivery, support to breastfeed or have skin-to-skin contact with their newborns if they wish to, regardless of their coronavirus status, effective pain management during labor, birth position of their choice, and C-sections should only be performed when medically indicated. So then we started to track how much, so we took note of that, but then we also started, some of our reporters started saying clear violations of this. For instance, when hospitals banned visitors, that often included any companions that women in labor had. So we started to see stories of fathers and other companions waiting in hospital parking lots for days, not being allowed onto the ward while their partners labored alone, without support, or dealt with post-delivery without support. So we started to notice these things, and we started to track them globally. Our contributors and reporters across the many countries in which we are present started logging reports in other media about this kind of, the ways in which women were falling through the cracks, women giving birth were falling through the cracks, and also started doing their own reporting. So we did that over the first 3 months of within which the first 3 months of the pandemic. For 3 months after the declaration of COVID-19 as a global pandemic, all through March, April, May, and June, our reporters were using an online form to log what they either were learning about from their own reporting, or were reading about from local press. And by July, we found that these WHO guidelines, we had evidence that these WHO guidelines had been violated in 45 countries. In fact, in some countries, it went beyond just violating guidelines of care. In at least 6 countries, women died. This was most especially common in Africa, where there were no ambulatory services, and yet governments announced the same restrictions on public transportation, same restrictions on moving, on leaving your home, as were being announced around the world during that time. But it wasn't restricted to Africa. For instance, in the United States, a woman died because hospitals shows hospitals switched maternity antenatal care to telemedicine. And even though she said she didn't feel well, she really needed to see a doctor, she was not allowed to go in, and a life-threatening illness was not caught, because she was just talking to the doctor either by email or the phone. And so she bled out eventually, unfortunately, in theater during delivery. So we're seeing lots of things like that in India: overcrowding, panic around who has COVID-19, who doesn't, how infectious it was, had hospitals turning away women, and that leading to deaths in some cases. So we're seeing things like that, logging them, and in the end, we actually had at least we had cases in 45 countries. I'm sure it was more than this, but we're also limited by the number of countries where we had reporters, or where our reporters spoke the language of in which the local press was publishing some of these stories. So we released that investigation in July. There were certain patterns across regions. For instance, from Latin America, we got lots of reports of women being forced into C-sections. Doctors advising women to have C-sections just so they can give birth before hospitals had filled up too much, or they can leave the hospitals quickly enough, or the doctor could control how much time that delivery takes. So that was a common theme in Latin America, but also for countries that were already struggling, like Venezuela. The combination of COVID-19 and economic collapse and was like really, we found really resulted into hellish conditions, women being abandoned, left to give birth on their own, giving birth in hospital corridors without anyone care, without any care, being rushed through care, not fully informed about what care they were going to receive, what kind of treatment they were receiving, what kind of procedures they were receiving, and why they were receiving those procedures. For example, this woman who had waited a really long time, had actually been bounced between hospitals, and then while she was in labor. And then eventually she had a really difficult delivery and was rushed to theater. And in the theater, doctors made the decision to, the doctors made decisions without, again, because there were no companions allowed in hospitals, none of her family members was involved, nobody was involved in making the decision for her other than health staff. Anyhow, they removed her ovaries and didn't tell her about it until the day after. So it was really heartbreaking experiences across the world. And in Latin America, it was especially jarring because a number of Latin American countries have laws against obstetric violence, but in the panic of the pandemic, with everybody making up their own rules, or governments leaving it to hospitals to decide which rules still apply during the pandemic, women were basically accidental victims of all of this. In Europe, the most common reports we got were women being separated or not allowed to have companions in hospitals. And some people say, well, it was understandable. It was the beginning of a pandemic. It was nobody knew what was safe and what wasn't. But we actually found that in some cases, like general restrictions would be lifted, like lockdown has been lifted, and women are still not allowed to go to hospital with their companions. Or in the UK, at one point, you could go to the, your partner could go to the pub, but not escort you to hospital for antenatal care. So it was very, it was a hot mess, and a hot mess at the expense of women across the world. Africa, like I said, those like countries wholesale picked the same restrictions better resourced countries had put in place, is sometimes even doing more than better resourced countries were doing in terms of restrictions, like they restricted public transport. And that led to a number of reports of mothers dying, waiting for ambulances. In the absence of ambulances, mothers walking really, really long distances to try and get to hospital while in labor. Often after labor has been, they've attempted a home birth, and it's obviously labor that needs medical attention. So then they set off on foot to walk towards hospital, and to walk towards hospital, and don't make it to hospital, or make it to hospital and bleed, make it to hospital too late. Meanwhile, still in Africa, we still were seeing sort of this, I mean, if you think of women or pregnant women as in the family way, we were not seeing in some places like Europe and Latin America, civil society was quite active. Like lawyers were helping women draft letters to hospitals citing the laws they were breaking. Birth rights organizations in Europe were supporting women to petition hospitals for more considerate restrictions. But in Africa, and so what we're seeing is sort of the organizations that have branded themselves the voices of family, pro-family organizations, were doing the same thing they do all year round every year, which is fighting reproductive health care. So like organizations, and in fact, you're seeing like organizations like Citizen Go, which are going to be familiar to the rest of you who do this work elsewhere, are becoming more and more active in Africa, and again, keeping the conversation at basically anti-rights work, fighting laws that seek to expand access to care. So that was kind of what the picture looked like in Africa. We released the investigation, and I think for us, as we thought it was really, I mean, we're very angry being women. My team is led by almost all women and LGBTI people. We're quite disturbed and angry by the things we had learned over the months. But we actually, when we released the investigation, we found reception to it kind of lukewarm. We did reach out to aid donors, for instance, who fund maternity care, and we got kind of lukewarm reactions saying this is disturbing, this is concerning, we're going to reshare our guidelines with our grantees. But it was not, it was, at least to me, it was like terribly shocking to the women, terribly shocking to us, the journalists, but apparently not to a lot of people in decision-making power, including government representatives telling us, oh, you have to understand it was in the middle of a pandemic. Even, you can't expect us to keep on top of that. Just kind of was sort of a heartbreaking, but once again, women are what falls through the cracks when push comes to shove. Anyhow, so I guess it's just something I wanted to leave with this group, which is how do you get people to care a lot more and to not see women's welfare, women's well-being as sort of this something that can be put aside when, you know, when there's another crisis to mind. And yeah, so anyhow, but it wasn't all gloom. We also found some, this one doctor and others, like, it wasn't all gloom. In fact, when we shared our findings with providers themselves, we had doctors, really, doctors came out strongly, quite different, and unlike sort of the aid donors, policymakers, the people in charge of healthcare in governments, or even the WHO. We found like some doctors were quite disturbed by this, and came out strongly in condemning what had happened to women. But I think the sort of the difference between the reaction of officialdom and doctors, at least for me, had me thinking, what we need to be thinking about care beyond what just requiring sort of guidelines, protocols. I mean, when we talk to human rights lawyers, I mean, there were laws that were broken, international treaties on women's rights and protocols were ignored. WHO guidelines were floated everywhere, and it didn't seem like WHO had any beyond, you know, advice. They seemed optional, especially because there's no way to enforce them. There's no penalty for not observing them. It's just basically, it's advisory. So then I think since we've been thinking quite a bit about how do you, what could possibly work, and I just wanted to leave you with this story about an Alabama doctor who calls herself, well, she doesn't just call herself, who has chosen to identify as a feminist doctor. And to me, that concept is really interesting. Like, what would feminist medicine look like? What happens if you popularize? Because in this sea of abuse and neglect, and you had this one doctor placing themselves there for women to call when they wanted, even, I mean, you know, especially now in the pandemic, when they wanted obstetrics care. And it was a very political position, action on her part, very consciously political decision to make, to provide medical service in a feminist manner. And I find that idea quite inspiring, and I find myself thinking there should be feminist movements in everything, including these sort of seen as just science, just science fields, that it really makes a difference for providers to see themselves as feminists and to see the full humanity of women, and to be advocates for women, and to put women's welfare ahead, front and center, in what they do, regardless of what else is going on. So that was our work. You can find the stories. It looks like I can't advance. Yeah, right. You can find our news stories and investigations on Tracking the Backlash, the openDemocracy.net/Tracking the Backlash. Like I said, most of the time we are investigating organized opposition to women's sexual and reproductive health rights and LGBTIQ rights. You can get in touch with us via email or follow us on Twitter, but also you can sign up for our newsletter at this link. But if you want to read the stories themselves, having a hard time, the stories about maternity care during COVID, this is the link here, openDemocracy.net/ EN for English, 50/50, which is the feminist section that I work for, and then childbirth during COVID-19. You can like toggle between. You can look at the maps with some of the stories we found. It's then all the stories we found. We just wanted to like drop at least one for every country for which we had a report, but you can take a look at it. You can take a look at it all at this link. You see all the different stories so we did on this, and that's us. Thank you for having us.